In the dusty frontier town of Bitter Creek, Texas, 1847, Sheriff Jonas Harwell faces his darkest hour. Scarred by war and haunted by loss, the 35-year-old lawman has sworn off love, believing himself cursed to walk alone. But when notorious outlaw Black Pete Donovan is captured, Judge Cornelius Whitmore delivers an unexpected verdict. Jonas must marry Donovan's spirited daughter, Clara, to secure her future and prevent a blood feud that threatens to tear the town apart. What begins as a forced union between two wounded souls becomes an unlikely journey of redemption as they discover that sometimes the heart finds its way even when the mind resists. If you're ready for a tale of unexpected love on the American frontier, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories, and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching this epic Western romance unfold. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the weathered wooden buildings of Bitter Creek, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Sheriff Jonas Harwell stood motionless on the porch of his office, his weathered hands resting on the carved oak railing his predecessor had installed years before anyone could remember. The town bustled with its usual afternoon activity, cowboys herding cattle through the streets, women in long dresses hurrying between the general store and the boarding house, children chasing chickens around the blacksmith shop, but Jonas saw none of it. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in memories that refused to fade. At 35, Jonas carried himself like a man who had seen too much and lost even more. His dark hair was streaked with premature gray at the temples, and deep lines etched his face around eyes that had once been warm brown, but now resembled cold coffee left too long in winter. 3 years ago, he had returned from the Mexican-American War with a purple heart and scars that ran deeper than the jagged mark across his left shoulder. The war had taken his younger brother Samuel, and consumption had claimed his fiancée Margaret, just 6 months after his return. Since then, Jonas had built walls around his heart higher than the mountains surrounding their little town. The townspeople whispered about their sheriff. They respected his unwavering dedication to justice and his quick draw that had sent more than one troublemaker packing, but they worried about his solitary existence. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house often brought him meals, insisting he looked too thin. Reverend Mitchell tried weekly to convince him to attend church social gatherings. Even old Doc Williams had suggested that perhaps Jonas needed something more than duty to keep him going. But Jonas remained steadfast in his belief that he was meant to walk alone, that those he loved were destined to leave him one way or another. The afternoon calm was shattered by thundering hoofbeats and shouting voices. Jonas instinctively reached for his Colt. 45 as a cloud of dust announced the arrival of his deputy, young Billy Crawford, leading a group of tired horses and even more exhausted men. Billy, barely 22 with sandy hair and an eager smile that reminded Jonas painfully of his late brother, dismounted quickly and bounded up the steps. "Sheriff Harwell," Billy called, his voice breathless with excitement and exhaustion. "We got him. We finally got Black Pete Donovan." Behind Billy, 4 other deputies were carefully helping a man down from his horse. The prisoner's hands were bound tight with rope, and his once fancy black coat was torn and dusty from what had clearly been a difficult capture. Jonas felt his jaw tighten as he studied the infamous outlaw. Peter "Black Pete" Donovan had been terrorizing the territories for over 2 years, robbing banks, rustling cattle, and leaving a trail of destruction from Oklahoma to the Mexican border. The man was shorter than Jonas had expected, perhaps 5'8", with graying black hair and a beard that had once been meticulously groomed but now hung ragged around his weathered face. What struck Jonas most were Donovan's eyes. Not the cold, calculating gaze he had expected from such a notorious criminal, but eyes filled with a weariness that Jonas recognized in his own mirror each morning. "Where did you find him?" Jonas asked, stepping down to inspect their prisoner more closely. Donovan's clothes, though dirty and torn, were clearly expensive, the kind of finery that spoke of successful robberies and a taste for the finer things in life. Gold chains still hung from his vest pocket, and his boots, despite the wear, were made of the finest leather money could buy. "Caught him trying to cross the Rio Grande about 15 miles southwest," Billy replied, unable to contain his pride. "Wasn't expecting us to be waiting on the other side. Had 2 bags of gold coins with him, probably from that bank job in San Antonio last month." Billy gestured toward the horses where Jonas could see bulging saddlebags that undoubtedly contained evidence of Donovan's crimes. As they escorted Donovan into the jail, Jonas noticed something unexpected. The outlaw's gaze kept drifting toward the horizon, not with the look of a man planning escape, but with the expression of someone who had left something precious behind. It was a look Jonas had seen in the eyes of dying soldiers who whispered about sweethearts and families they would never see again. "You got family, Donovan?" Jonas asked as he locked the cell door. The question came out more gently than he had intended, perhaps influenced by that strange sadness he had glimpsed in the outlaw's eyes. Donovan looked up sharply, suspicion flickering across his features before being replaced by something that might have been pain. "Why do you care, Sheriff? Planning to use them against me?" His voice carried a slight Irish accent, refined despite his current circumstances. "Just curious," Jonas replied, hanging the heavy iron keys on their hook. "Most men in your position start talking about someone they're leaving behind." He studied Donovan's face carefully, noting the way the man's jaw clenched at the mention of family. For a long moment, Donovan said nothing, staring at the rough wooden floor of his cell. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have a daughter, Clara. She's 23, lives with her aunt in Santa Fe. Hasn't seen me in 3 years, and that's probably for the best." The admission seemed to physically pain him, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his choices had suddenly become unbearable. Jonas felt an unexpected twinge of sympathy. "What made you choose this life, then, if you had someone to go home to?" The question surprised even Jonas himself. He rarely engaged prisoners in personal conversation, preferring to maintain professional distance. Donovan's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "Choice? You think I chose this?" He looked up at Jonas with eyes that suddenly blazed with anger and regret. "I was a businessman once, Sheriff. Had a small ranch, raised horses. Clara's mother died when she was born, and I did my best to raise her right. Then the war came and I lost everything. Carpetbaggers took my land while I was fighting for this country. When I came back, I had nothing left to give my little girl except the promise that I'd find a way to make things right again." The jail fell silent except for the sound of wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden walls. Jonas found himself staring at this man who had become the most wanted outlaw in 3 territories, seeing not the monster he had expected, but a father who had lost his way trying to provide for his child. It was a story Jonas had heard variations of countless times since the war ended. Good men driven to desperate measures by desperate circumstances. Outside, the church bell began to toll, marking the approach of evening. Jonas knew that tomorrow Judge Cornelius Whitmore would arrive on the morning stage to preside over Donovan's trial. The judge was known throughout the territories for his swift justice and creative sentences, but Jonas had never seen a case quite like this one. As he prepared to leave Donovan alone with his thoughts, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring changes to Bitter Creek that none of them could anticipate. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek with the promise of another sweltering day, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Jonas of the sunrises he used to watch with Margaret from the hill behind her father's farm. He had barely slept, spending most of the night pacing his small quarters above the jail, his mind churning over his conversation with Black Pete Donovan. Something about the outlaw's story had stirred memories Jonas preferred to keep buried, reminders of his own losses and the choices that had led him to this solitary existence. Jonas descended the narrow wooden stairs to find Donovan awake, sitting on the edge of his cot with his head in his hands. The morning light streaming through the barred window revealed details that the previous evening's shadows had hidden. The fine lines around Donovan's eyes that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow. The calloused hands that suggested honest work before his life took its dark turn. And most surprisingly, a small silver locket hanging from a chain around his neck. "Didn't expect to see you up so early," Jonas commented as he checked the locks and began his morning routine. He had learned over the years that maintaining normalcy, even in unusual circumstances, helped keep both prisoners and himself steady. Donovan looked up with bloodshot eyes that suggested he had slept no better than Jonas. "Hard to sleep when you know the hangman's rope is waiting for you," he replied, his Irish accent more pronounced in the morning quiet. "Tell me, Sheriff, do you have children? Anyone who depends on you?" The question hit Jonas like a physical blow. He paused in his movements, his hand tightening around the coffee pot he had been reaching for. "No," he said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "No family? No children? It's better that way." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, a familiar mantra he repeated whenever the loneliness became too overwhelming. "Better?" Donovan stood and approached the bars of his cell, studying Jonas with an intensity that made the sheriff uncomfortable. "You're lying to yourself, man. I can see it in your eyes. The same emptiness I carried for years after my Mary died. The difference is I had Clara to fight for. What do you fight for, Sheriff Harwell?" Before Jonas could formulate an answer, the sound of approaching horses and wheels announced the arrival of the morning stage from Austin. Through the window, Jonas could see the familiar black coach with its team of 6 horses, dust billowing behind it like a storm cloud. Judge Cornelius Whitmore had arrived precisely on schedule, as he always did. Judge Whitmore was a man who commanded attention simply by existing. Tall and imposing at 62, with silver hair and a meticulously groomed beard, he possessed the kind of presence that could silence a rowdy courtroom with a single glance. He had been appointed as a circuit judge 15 years earlier, and had built a reputation for fairness tempered with an almost legendary creativity in his sentencing. Jonas had seen him order cattle rustlers to work on the very ranches they had robbed, sentence claim jumpers to help their victims rebuild what they had destroyed, and once famously require a man who had abandoned his family to spend 6 months caring for orphans at the mission in San Antonio. As the judge climbed down from the coach, adjusting his black coat and straightening his string tie, Jonas noticed he was not alone. A woman descended gracefully from the passenger compartment, and Jonas felt his breath catch in his throat. She was perhaps 23, with auburn hair pinned up beneath a blue traveling bonnet, and a face that combined strength with an almost ethereal beauty. Her dress, while practical for travel, was well made and spoke of refinement and good taste. But it was her eyes that truly captured Jonas's attention, green as spring grass, and filled with a mixture of determination and barely contained anxiety. "Sheriff Harwell," Judge Whitmore called, his voice carrying easily across the dusty street. "I trust our prisoner is secure and ready for trial?" He approached with measured steps, the woman following closely behind, her gaze fixed on the jail building with an intensity that made Jonas suddenly understand who she must be. "Yes, sir, Judge Whitmore," Jonas replied, though his eyes kept drifting to the young woman. "Peter Donovan is secured and awaiting your justice." He hesitated, then added, "Might I ask who the lady is?" The judge's expression grew serious, and he exchanged a meaningful glance with his companion. "Sheriff, this is Miss Clara Donovan. She has traveled from Santa Fe upon learning of her father's capture. She wishes to speak with him before the trial begins." The judge's tone suggested there was more to the story, but he seemed disinclined to elaborate in the middle of the street. Clara stepped forward, her chin raised with a defiance that reminded Jonas painfully of Margaret's stubborn streak. "Sheriff Harwell, I know what my father has done, and I'm not here to make excuses for him, but he's still my father, and I won't let him face his fate alone." Her voice carried the same slight Irish accent as her father's, but refined by education and softened by what Jonas suspected was a naturally compassionate nature. Jonas found himself staring, struck not just by her beauty but by the quiet strength in her bearing. Here was a woman who had traveled hundreds of dangerous miles through territory crawling with bandits and hostile tribes, all to stand by a father who had chosen a life of crime. It spoke of a loyalty and courage that Jonas had rarely encountered, even among the hardened men of the frontier. "Of course, Miss Donovan," Jonas managed, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "I'll arrange for you to have privacy with your father." He unlocked the jail door, acutely aware of how small and rough his usually adequate facilities must seem to someone of Clara's obvious refinement. As they entered the jail, Donovan's reaction to seeing his daughter was immediate and heartbreaking. The tough outlaw who had robbed banks and faced down armed posies crumpled like a child, tears streaming down his weathered face as he gripped the bars of his cell. "Clara, my darling girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have to see me like this." His hands reached through the bars toward her, and she immediately grasped them, her own tears flowing freely despite her obvious efforts to remain strong. "Papa," she said simply, and in that single word, Jonas heard years of love, disappointment, hope, and forgiveness. He quietly withdrew to give them privacy, but not before noticing Judge Whitmore's thoughtful expression as he observed the reunion between father and daughter. Outside the jail, the judge placed a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "Sheriff, I believe this case will require some unconventional thinking. Would you join me for breakfast at the boarding house? There are matters we need to discuss before the trial begins." The judge's tone suggested that Jonas's input would be more than welcomed. It would be essential. As they walked toward Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Jonas couldn't shake the image of Clara Donovan's tear-filled eyes or the sound of her voice saying "Papa" with such profound love and pain. Something was stirring in his chest, an emotion he had thought permanently buried with Margaret's death, and it terrified him more than any gunfight he had ever faced. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house dining room was filled with the comforting aromas of fresh coffee, bacon, and biscuits, but Jonas found his appetite had completely disappeared. He sat across from Judge Whitmore at a corner table, occasionally glancing through the lace-curtained window toward the jail where Clara remained with her father. The judge had been unusually quiet during their walk, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man wrestling with a difficult decision. "Sheriff," Judge Whitmore began, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate care, "in my 15 years on the bench, I have encountered many cases that challenged conventional wisdom. But this situation with Peter Donovan presents complications that extend far beyond simple criminal justice." The judge's gray eyes held a gravity that made Jonas lean forward attentively. "What kind of complications, Judge?" Jonas asked, though something in the older man's demeanor suggested he was about to hear something that would change everything. Judge Whitmore pulled a telegram from his coat pocket and placed it on the table between them. "This arrived yesterday from Sheriff Martinez in Santa Fe. It seems that Black Pete Donovan's capture has stirred up more than we anticipated. His former gang, led by a man called Scarface Murphy, has sworn a blood oath to avenge their leader. They've already burned down 2 homesteads belonging to families they believe cooperated with the law, and they've made it clear that anyone connected to Donovan's capture will pay the price." Jonas felt a chill run down his spine as he read the telegram. The descriptions of the attacks were brutal. Entire families murdered, livestock slaughtered, crops burned. These weren't just criminals seeking revenge, they were savages intent on spreading terror throughout the territory. "There's more," the judge continued, his voice dropping lower. "Clara Donovan has no other family except an elderly aunt who can barely care for herself. If we hang her father, which justice clearly demands, she becomes a target. Murphy's gang knows that hurting Donovan's daughter would be the ultimate revenge against a man they can no longer reach." The implications hit Jonas like a physical blow. "You're saying that even after we execute Donovan, his daughter will never be safe?" "Precisely. And there's another consideration." Judge Whitmore leaned back in his chair, studying Jonas with an intensity that made the sheriff uncomfortable. "I've made inquiries about Miss Donovan. She's educated, well-mannered, and has been supporting herself and her aunt by teaching school in Santa Fe. By all accounts, she's a remarkable young woman who has risen above her father's choices. She deserves a chance at a decent life, not to spend her remaining years looking over her shoulder for murderers seeking revenge." Jonas stared out the window, his mind racing. Through the glass he could see Clara emerging from the jail, her face pale but composed. Even from this distance he could see the strength in her bearing, the way she held her head high despite the circumstances that had brought her to this dusty frontier town. "What are you proposing, Judge?" Jonas asked, though something in his gut told him he already knew the answer. Judge Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, then spoke with the measured tone of a man who had carefully considered every angle of a complex problem. "There is a legal precedent, Sheriff, dating back to territorial law established in 1836. In cases where a convicted criminal's family faces retribution that could destabilize an entire region, a judge may order protective custody through binding matrimony to a suitable law enforcement officer." Jonas's coffee cup clattered against its saucer as his hand began to shake. "You're talking about arranged marriage, Judge? Forced marriage. I'm talking about survival, Sheriff Harwell. For Miss Donovan, for this town, and perhaps for you as well." The judge's eyes held a compassion that took Jonas by surprise. "I've watched you for 3 years, Jonas. You're a good man who has convinced himself that isolation is strength, but I've also seen how that isolation is slowly destroying you. You need something to fight for beyond duty, and that young woman needs someone strong enough to protect her from the storm that's coming." Before Jonas could respond, Clara herself appeared in the doorway of the dining room. Mrs. Henderson guided her to their table, and Jonas immediately stood, his upbringing demanding courtesy even as his mind reeled from the judge's proposal. "Miss Donovan," Judge Whitmore said gently, "please sit. There are matters we must discuss that will affect your future significantly." Clara took the offered chair, her green eyes moving between the two men with a wariness that suggested she sensed the gravity of whatever was about to be discussed. "Has my father's fate been decided?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Your father will stand trial this afternoon," the judge replied. "Given the evidence against him and his own admission of guilt, the sentence will undoubtedly be death by hanging. However, Miss Donovan, there are circumstances surrounding your father's case that place you in considerable danger." As Judge Whitmore explained the threat from Murphy's gang and the lack of safe options for Clara's future, Jonas found himself studying her face. He watched her expression shift from confusion to understanding, to a kind of resigned courage that reminded him of soldiers facing overwhelming odds. When the judge finally explained his proposed solution, Clara's reaction surprised them both. "You want me to marry Sheriff Harwell," she said calmly, her gaze shifting to Jonas for the first time since entering the room. "A complete stranger, to save my life and give me protection from my father's enemies." "Miss Donovan," Jonas began, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite identify. "I want you to know that I would never, that is, this would be a marriage of protection only. I would expect nothing from you except to allow me to keep you safe." Clara studied his face for a long moment, and Jonas felt as if she was seeing straight through to his soul. "And what would you gain from such an arrangement, Sheriff Harwell? Surely protecting a criminal's daughter would bring you nothing but trouble." The question hung in the air between them, and Jonas found himself answering with an honesty that surprised even him. "I've been alone for a long time, Miss Donovan. Maybe too long. If I can keep you safe and maybe find some purpose beyond just existing from one day to the next, then perhaps we both gain something from this arrangement." Clara was quiet for nearly a full minute, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant as she contemplated a future she had never imagined. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a strength that made Jonas's chest tighten with an emotion he thought he had forgotten how to feel. "Very well," she said, looking directly into Jonas's eyes. "If this marriage can save my life and perhaps give meaning to yours, then I accept your proposal, Sheriff Harwell. But I have one condition. I want to be at my father's trial. Whatever his crimes, he shouldn't face his final moments alone." The makeshift courtroom in Bitter Creek's town hall filled quickly that afternoon, with nearly every resident of the small frontier community crowding onto the wooden benches to witness what many considered the most significant trial in the territory's recent history. Jonas stood at the back of the room in his best shirt and jacket, freshly shaved and trying to ignore the curious stares from townspeople who had heard rumors about the upcoming marriage. Beside him, Clara sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of composed grief that broke Jonas's heart. Judge Whitmore had transformed the simple room into a proper court with remarkable efficiency. Behind the makeshift bench, an American flag hung proudly, while the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows cast everything in a golden glow that seemed inappropriately peaceful for such somber proceedings. "Bring in the prisoner," Judge Whitmore commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of judicial authority. Jonas escorted Peter Donovan into the courtroom, the outlaw's hands shackled but his head held high. Donovan had insisted on wearing his cleanest shirt for the trial, and Clara had managed to find him a string tie that gave him an air of dignity, despite his circumstances. As father and daughter's eyes met across the crowded room, Jonas saw Donovan's composure nearly break before the man steeled himself for what he knew would be their final goodbye. The trial itself was swift and efficient, as frontier justice typically was when the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified to Donovan's crimes: bank robberies in Austin and San Antonio, stagecoach holdups, and the shooting of a Wells Fargo guard who later died from his wounds. Throughout it all, Donovan sat quietly, never denying the charges, never offering excuses or explanations. When Judge Whitmore asked for his final statement, Donovan rose slowly and turned to face the packed courtroom. "I ain't gonna stand here and make excuses for what I've done," he said, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "I chose the wrong path after my wife died, and good men suffered because of my choices. I accept whatever punishment this court sees fit to give me." He paused, his eyes finding Clara in the crowd. "But I want everyone here to know that my daughter Clara is a good woman who never supported my crimes. She tried to convince me to change my ways, and I was too stubborn and angry to listen. Whatever happens to me, she deserves your respect and your protection." Judge Whitmore's voice was solemn as he pronounced the inevitable sentence. "Peter Donovan, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out at dawn tomorrow morning. May God have mercy on your soul." As the courtroom began to empty, Jonas approached Clara, who remained seated despite the chaos around them. Tears streamed down her face, but she maintained the same quiet dignity that had impressed him from their first meeting. "Miss Donovan," Jonas said gently, offering her his arm, "perhaps we should proceed with the other matter Judge Whitmore discussed." The wedding ceremony took place just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reminded Jonas of the sunrises he used to share with Margaret. Mrs. Henderson had decorated the boarding house parlor with wildflowers, and the few witnesses included Judge Whitmore, Dr. Morrison, and the town's preacher, Reverend Matthews. Clara had changed into a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and Jonas found himself genuinely moved by her quiet beauty and grace. As they stood before Reverend Matthews, Jonas realized that what had begun as a practical arrangement was already becoming something deeper. "Do you, Jonas Harwell, take Clara Donovan to be your lawfully wedded wife, to protect and cherish her for as long as you both shall live?" the Reverend asked. Reverend, I do, Jonas replied, his voice steady and sure as he looked into Clara's eyes and saw not just acceptance, but the beginning of something that might, in time, become real affection. Do you, Clara Donovan, take Jonas Harwell to be your lawfully wedded husband, to honor and support him for as long as you both shall live? Clara's voice was soft but clear. I do. As they exchanged simple gold bands that Dr. Morrison had contributed from his own supply, Jonas felt something shift inside his chest, a warming that he had thought permanently frozen by years of loneliness and loss. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the grim duty that Jonas had dreaded. Clara insisted on being present for her father's final moments, and Jonas stood beside her as Donovan faced his fate with a courage that earned him grudging respect, even from those who despised his crimes. Take care of my Clara, Donovan whispered to Jonas as they placed the noose around his neck. She's the best thing I ever did in this life. I will, Jonas promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. As the sun rose fully over Bitter Creek, Jonas and Clara stood together on the porch of what was now their shared home above the jail. She leaned against his shoulder, not from romantic love, not yet, but from the simple human need for comfort and connection. What happens now? Clara asked quietly, her hand finding his. Jonas squeezed her fingers gently, feeling for the first time in years that his future held possibilities beyond mere survival. Now we build something new, he said. Together. In the distance, a rider approached town, the first of many travelers who would pass through Bitter Creek over the coming months. But Jonas no longer faced the future alone. Beside him stood a woman of remarkable courage and strength, and together they would create a life that honored both the memory of those they had lost and the hope of what they might build together. They had both been people whom others expected to die alone, but fate and an wise judge had given them something neither had dared hope for, a second chance at happiness, forged in the harsh crucible of the American frontier. The end.